you. Well, I've been laboring for some years now on a set of theorems for a comprehensive philosophy of war, theorems parasitic on that behavioral axiom proffered us by Thomas Hobbes, namely that, and I quote, of course, "If any two men desire the same thing, which nonetheless they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies. And to that end, which is principally their own conservation, but sometimes their delectation only, they endeavor to destroy or subdue one another." Or, as I've rendered it, by war is meant any not necessarily spatio-temporally contiguous domain of interactivity in which each of two or more agents, given their competition for resources, take the other to be more valuable to him dead or in chains than alive and free, and each takes the other to so take the other. Now, whether these two characterizations of war are or are not strictly identical, I won't worry about here. Here, I only want to explore what Hobbes could have meant by or subdue, and what I could mean by or in chains. The natural association of subdue and enchain is with subjugation and enslavement. But I want to argue that this interpretation, at least of Hobbes' use of subdue and of my use of in chains, is mistaken. By this, I certainly don't mean to deny that an occupied people, like the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, are being subjugated by their occupier. And until 1865, African Americans were certainly enslaved by their white captors. But I want to argue that neither subjugation nor slavery has anything to do with what Hobbes had in mind by his or subdue, or what I have in mind by my or in chains. Rather, I want to parse subjugation and slavery as features of the erstwhile combatants' post-bellum arrangements, whereas subduing and enchaining are better understood as in-bello maneuvers. I'll be making that case momentarily, but in the meantime, why does this matter? It matters because over the years we've developed two sets of jurisprudential judgments backed up by two sets of moral intuitions. One we call jus in bello, the other jus post bellum. That is, we seem to think, both morally and legally, that in how we should treat each other, it matters a great deal whether we are or are not still fighting. So, for example, if we're still fighting, I can confine you to a prisoner of war camp, but as soon as we've declared an end to our hostilities, I have to release you. Well, Americans don't, but presumably you're supposed to. Until very recently, the in-post distinction did us yeoman service. But now that many of our wars involve enemies who, because they're so much more adept at dissimulating as friends, can't be identified until they're at our throats, think of the so-called homegrown terrorist, we're facing the following problem. In times of war, that one is even suspected of being an enemy combatant is deemed sufficient grounds, both morally and legally, to incarcerate him. This is what justified the internment of Japanese Americans and Canadians in the wake of Pearl Harbor. In times of peace, by contrast, one is entitled to due process and a much weightier burden of proof against him. Moreover, one cannot be prosecuted post-bellum for a crime for which his having been at war with us is fully exculpatory. Hence, the injustice of the conviction of Omar Khadr. Now, the Omar Khadr case, I'm not sure is one that non-Canadians are familiar with. Anyhow, you might want to look it up. It's a fascinating case. And so what the Americans have done since 9/11 is rather than declare a war on an identifiable enemy, they've declared a war on an ism. Of course, they've called it a war on terrorism, but few of us are fooled. The attacks on the USS Cole and the Pentagon were counted as terrorist attacks even though they were both against military targets, whereas the Israeli shelling of civilians in Gaza, though it most certainly was terrorism, isn't counted as such. Note that the U.S. did not declare war on the IRA or Baader-Meinhof or FARC or the Red Brigades or Shining Path or the Irgun. So really it's just a war on jihadism. It's what Samuel P. Huntington predicted would be the clash of civilizations. And since no war on an ism can ever be over, the Americans have entitled themselves to hold their jihadist captives in Guantanamo Bay until the day they die. So the problem, if problem there be, lies not in American jurisprudential thinking. The problem is that this jurisprudence was developed to protect soldiers of an identifiable enemy in a war we had reason to believe would come to an end. It never occurred to the framers of the Hague and Geneva Conventions on the treatment of prisoners of war that these conventions would be circumvented, as the Americans have done, by this kind of definitional sleight of hand. Or consider the distinction between the West Bank and Gaza. Both are occupied in the sense that Israel can exert its will on either territory pretty much with alacrity. But whereas Israel has successfully installed a quisling regime in the West Bank, the like attempt has failed miserably in Gaza. The reason for this is clear enough. Israel needs cheap Arab labor, and the West Bank is close enough to provide it, whereas Gaza is not. So, or at least arguably, the albeit highly limited freedom to come and go that Palestinians in the West Bank enjoy can be regarded as a post-bellum dividend of their albeit precarious peace with the Israelis. But Palestinians in Gaza enjoy no freedom of movement whatsoever. They're surrounded by a well-guarded fence to the north and east, by Israeli gunboats to the west, and Israeli soldiers control the border with Egypt. In short, Gaza is not just enclosed by the Israelis, as was the Warsaw Ghetto by the Germans. It is, no less than Auschwitz, a concentration camp, into which the Israelis are at liberty to enter at will, to impose whatever discipline they will, and to exact whatever reprisals they judge advisable for any resistance to that imposition. African slaves were brought to America in irons, but a captive still in irons does not a good field laborer make. And so their owners removed those irons as soon as they judged it safe to do so. For the most part, when they realized there was nowhere to run, these captives did not run away. So they were slaves, to be sure, but their slavery was a post-bellum condition. And so by parity of reasoning, the oppression of the Palestinians in the West Bank is likewise their post-bellum condition. The Palestinians in Gaza, by contrast, are prisoners of war and therefore still at war, at least according to this analysis. That at any rate is the argument I want to make, but first I need to issue a lengthy disclaimer. The conditions of going to war, on both Hobbes' account and mine, have been spelled out above, and these are the same on both our view, whether we're talking about the war of all against all in the state of nature, or war between two sovereign states. Moreover, we're both of a mind that a war, be it of all against all or between two sovereign states, comes to an end when, in Hobbes' words, quote, a man is willing when the other is so too, as far forth and for peace and defense of himself he shall think it necessary to lay down his claim to the entirety of whatever it is they've been fighting over, and be contented with that share of it assigned to him by whatever articles of peace that may emerge from their negotiations. In Hobbes' view, in the case of the war of all against all in the state of nature, these articles amount to, quote, so much liberty against other men as one would allow other men against himself. And, he infamously concludes, this in turn amounts to no liberty at all, save the liberty of self-defense. In the case of war between sovereigns, however, the articles of peace will involve assignments of territory, or fishing quotas, or reparations, or whatever. But I've argued that on his own terms, Hobbes cannot draw the distinction he needs between war and peace, neither between individuals escaping the state of nature, nor between sovereigns, and therefore neither can he give me the distinction I now need between phenomena to be located in bello and those to be located post bellum. The reason for this is Hobbes' own acknowledgement that, quote, force and fraud are the two cardinal virtues of war. But since fraud is a perfectly legitimate instrument of war, Hobbes can no more rule out an individual or sovereign being only fraudulently signatory to these articles of peace than he can rule out fraudulent surrender. For, as he himself concedes, the force of words are too weak to hold men to the performance of their covenants. In my own work, I've named this the counterfeit white flag problem. But I have to be careful about drawing too strong a conclusion from it. The counterfeit white flag problem doesn't prove there is no distinction between war and peace. After all, it may well be that we each now do regard each other as more valuable alive and free than dead or in chains. But even when this is the case, the counterfeit white flag problem renders these two states, war and peace, epistemically indistinguishable. They're epistemically indistinguishable because I can never tell, when you've agreed to these articles of peace, whether you regard fidelity to these articles preferable to war, or you're only pretending to regard them as such in the hope that I'll drop my guard. And so, discretion being the better part of valor, the smart money goes on always bethinking ourselves in a state of war, which is only dissimulating as a state of peace. That one or both of us is just waiting for the weather to change, or for confederacies to reconfigurate, or for our secret stash of weapons to reach some critical mass, or whatever. That these two states are epistemically indistinguishable does not mean they're phenomenologically indistinguishable. Notwithstanding the clock radio is on her side of the bed, I fall asleep at night trusting that my wife values me more alive than dead. So far. I don't flinch when I drive under an overpass because I trust there's no one standing above it who'd like to see me dead. As an epistemic term, this trust is only probably well-founded, but as a term in the phenomenology of sleeping or driving, it's indispensable. But if I'm right about the epistemic collapse of the war versus peace distinction, then it would seem the in bello post bellum distinction collapses with it, and our present inquiry is at an end. What Hobbes means by or subdue just is what the natural interpretation takes it to mean, as does what I mean by or in chains. If the epistemic distinction between war and peace collapses, then we're well advised to believe we're always at war. So subjugation is war, slavery is war, what masquerades as civil society is war. It's all war. It's not, as von Clausewitz thought, that war is the continuation of politics by other means. It's that politics is the continuation of war by other means. But oddly enough, I'm going to assume I'm wrong. And I'm going to do so for the following reason. In my teaching and writing in the philosophy of religion, I try not to undermine the believer's faith, but to deepen it. To deepen it by helping her render her faith as internally coherent as possible. That is, as an atheistic Jew, for me, Christianity is just, well, silly, as is my own residual Judaism. But they're sillinesses that will not be done away with anytime soon, and so they're sillinesses we all have to live with, if not in ourselves, then certainly in others. But that said, there are some sillinesses that nonetheless have been, or at least can be, highly constructive, such as the Jubilee laws, or the honoring of the Sabbath, or the Sermon on the Mount, from the Mount. And there are other sillinesses that have been and remain a vicious pox on human flourishing, such as that homosexuality is an abomination in the eyes of God, or that Zionism is justified because God gave Canaan to the Israelites. Never mind what made it his to give in the first place. So I make no apology for sullying my pristine philosophical hands with what my colleagues disparage as appeasement to all this religious nonsense. Similarly then, the fact that in my own view war and peace have been conceptually misparsed by the hoi polloi and political philosophers alike, is no more reason to dismiss thousands of years of insights into how to limit the damage from our intertribal predations than is the silliness of religion reason to dismiss thousands of years of insights into how, more generally, to get along with each other. And so, as I say, I'm just going to proceed as if our pre-theoretical and intuitive distinction between war and peace, however we might have misparsed it, is nonetheless a near enough good enough one. For this much is certain. We do need to treat prisoners of war and our own accused criminals differentially. And so whatever ontology we need to underpin that differential treatment is what we'll end up calling war and peace. The counterfeit white flag problem undermines our traditional ontology, but all this shows is that our traditional ontology is inadequate to the task at hand. It does not show that no alternative ontology could do better. Okay, now, that said, okay, walls. So why, according to Hobbes, would we subdue an enemy rather than destroy him? Why, according to me, would we enchain him rather than just kill him? As we've already seen, it can't be to put him to work for us. That would require us to be in a post-bellum condition with each other. So it must be for the same reason we destroy or kill him, and that is to remove him as a competitor for what it is we're fighting over. To be sure, we remove him by killing him. That's what battles and gas chambers are all about. But battles are risky, and gas chambers costly. So when the risks and costs of internment fall below those of killing, we opt for the former. Enchaining, interning, besieging are all of a piece. They're all just variations driven by the material exigencies of the case at hand on removing a threat. A prisoner of war is escorted to an internment camp by armed guards. There he's walled in, or what amounts to the same thing, walled out from his capacity to challenge us for whatever may be at stake in our conflict. So walls, all walls, are about keeping people from at least one side to getting to the other side. Likewise, and for the same reason, is an enemy army driven into a walled town that we subsequently besiege. If we control the gate, then he's interned, but if he does, then he simply barricaded himself. He can and will break out of his barricaded position if and when he likes his chances on the battlefield. Jerusalem was a walled city. In 1187, the Christian defenders of the city controlled its gates, but they did not like their chances on the battlefield against Saladin. By driving them to behind those walls, Saladin had already removed them from competition over control of Judea and could have kept them thus removed with only a few thousand of his men. Why then did he squander so many more of his men in taking the city? Because what he wanted wasn't just Judea, he wanted Jerusalem. From late September 1939 until August 1st, 1944, the Germans controlled the gates into and out of the Warsaw Ghetto. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising just was the Jews seizing control of those gates. Not with any hope of fighting the Germans outside the gates. That would have been, and they would have been and were, in fact, cut down within seconds. Rather, they seized the gates to put an end to the Germans entering the ghetto and shipping its residents off to be killed elsewhere, and then, once the uprising began, just killing them in situ. So why didn't the Germans just leave them be? Because besieging the ghetto was taking manpower away from the Russian front, and by most accounts, because exterminating the Jews was among Germany's war objectives. By contrast, had Saladin wanted the death of all infidels, he would not have allowed the Christian population, upon surrender of the city, safe passage to the sea. So whether one is walling oneself in or being walled in is a matter of who controls the ingress and egress. As to whether the wall is a barricade, as is whether the wall is a barricade or a prison. The Alamo was a barricade. Provided they surrendered their weapons, General Santana would have let its defenders return to their farms, subject to Mexican sovereignty, of course. Gaza is a concentration camp, but unlike Saladin, the Israelis have no interest in wresting its slums from the Palestinians within. To remove the threat of a breakout permanently, the Israelis could commit a Warsaw-like genocide, either in Gaza or in the West Bank or both. And if some Israelis had their druthers, that's exactly what they do. But for the vulnerability of Jews elsewhere in the world to swift and certain retaliation from Arabs elsewhere in the world. So for now, at least, concedes the Israeli right, walls will have to do. Now, for each of the last 2 summers, and there seems to be no end in sight, 500,000 refugees, either from civil war or abject poverty or both, have been braving the Sicilian Channel in rubber dinghies with only a slightly better than even chance of reaching Lampedusa alive. An even greater number of others have opted to try the Balkan route, walking only at night and dodging guards at the several borders that lie between Turkey and Austria. Both sea and land can serve as walls. And when those walls are being breached, armed soldiers on land and gunships at sea fill the breaches. But are these walls reinforced or constructed to prevent war, as the Israelis and Americans and now many Europeans have been arguing, or is their reinforcement or construction an act of war? On the analysis I've been providing, clearly the latter. Now, why do I argue this? Because in the absence of astronomical subsidies from European taxpayers, the most of these immigrants can hope for, and here I'm speaking mostly of the African and Maghreb immigrants, can hope for, even if they get all the way to France or Germany or England, is to subsist on gleanings, either literally, i.e. As the gleaners of old, or on rubbish heaps, or, as is the case throughout Italy, trying to sell knockoff purses outside a railway station or worthless trinkets on a beach. To be sure, gleaners are parasites, but they're parasites that impose no costs on their hosts. That's why gleaning was tolerated in those parts of the world where the practice once flourished. But too many gleaners will eventually exhaust the crop's leavings, and then, to subsist, they have to start stealing from the crop itself. This cannot be tolerated. The ratio of immigrants, legal or otherwise, in Italian prisons is on par with that of African Americans in American prisons and Aboriginal Canadians in Canadian prisons. And those ratios are getting worse, not better. And so Europeans find themselves between a rock and a hard place. They can't blockade these dinghies without incurring a charge of mass murder, but neither can they let them land and take their passengers aboard lifeboat Europe without endangering that lifeboat. And the Americans, of course, face a similar conundrum on their southern wall. So, if any two men desire the same thing, which nonetheless they cannot both enjoy. So, what to do? The libertarian solution, and this was mentioned in the last talk, the libertarians have argued that no one has a right to anyone else's largesse. So you'd think that libertarians would be anti-immigration. Not so. Rather, their claim is that borders are a violation of freedom of association. And sordid though it may be, that includes the right of some lonely first world geezer to import a willing sex partner from one of these disadvantaged countries. But they needn't confine their arguments to what we would call their exploitation. Why shouldn't I be able to hire an Eritrean to work in my abattoir at a fraction of the cost I have to pay a Canadian? He's certainly not being exploited. The walls we build at our borders serve the same function as the tariffs we impose at our ports. They're morally indistinguishable from the apartheid laws in South Africa, prohibiting conjugal relations between the races. Opposition to free trade, be it of goods or services or the people who produce the goods and services or provide the services, is bigotry masquerading as protectionism. At least this is the libertarian argument. By dismantling our borders and tariffs, we reduce the wages of our existing workers, but we also lower the price of the goods and services being produced. Eventually, these prices and populations reach equilibrium, at which point the Eritrean might just as well stay home. This was the argument, by the way, that Jan Narveson makes with respect to things like minimum wage and so on. So, concludes the libertarian, Jan Narveson, for example, the walls we build at our borders are an act of war, not only against those on the other side of it, but against many of those on this side of it as well, namely the person who wants to hire the Eritrean worker for his abattoir or wants to have sex with a prostitute from Jamaica. Now, the counter-argument isn't so much an argument as it is a confession. Yes, those walls are an act of war, but what of it? Nothing in Hobbes' analysis of war, or mine, suggests there's anything wrong with war other than the risks, expense, and incommodities it incurs. But for North Americans, these are relatively trivial. North Americans are surrounded by 3 oceans, a sizable sea, and the land bridge from the south is easily defended. And Australians and New Zealanders are in even more envious defensive position. Europeans, by contrast, are not so lucky. There's a wide land bridge from Asia running from the Arctic Ocean to the Dardanelles, and the natural wall called the Mediterranean has proven highly porous. So Europe's war against Asians, Africans, and of course their relatives already in Europe is much more costly, but as already noted, not nearly as costly as unconditional surrender. One way to view the war on those already inside our walls, who nonetheless want those walls demolished, is to regard those limitations on their rights of association as simply an article of our post-bellum agreement. After San Jacinto, Mexican Texans might have wanted to have continued truck with other Mexicans, but among the articles of peace they negotiated with other Texans was that this would no longer be the case. And it's likewise with our old Canadian geezer who wants to import his Jamaican prostitute. And so it's likewise with our abattoir owner who wants to import his Eritrean meat cutter. This way of parsing these matters does less violence to our linguistic and political intuitions than does thinking of ourselves as engaged in an ongoing and interminable civil war. So it certainly seems like a more attractive way to go, or at least it would, were it not for David Luban. So in his Just War and Human Rights, David Luban argues, as did Hobbes and Locke before him, that the rights of the sovereign are parasitic on those of the individuals countenancing his sovereignty. For Hobbes, there is only one such right, that of self-preservation. For Locke, self-preservation is only an element of a larger set called security of one's property. Luban thinks the sole justification of sovereignty is the protection of what he calls socially basic human rights. Luban announces himself uncertain as to what exactly are included in these socially basic human rights, but being a child of the 20th century, as distinct from the 17th, it's not unreasonable to assume he would hold, as do most of the rest of us, that these include freedom of association. So if the sovereign doesn't honor that right, he forfeits his right to govern. Thus, one could argue, in building walls to keep out those with whom we might otherwise want to associate. Remember, we're talking not about them wanting to associate with us. We're talking about us wanting to associate with them, right? Okay, the sovereign puts himself back at war with us just as surely as he would by Hobbes' lights were the sovereign to attack our person, or by Locke's were he to appropriate our property. Now, the particular axe that David Luban has to grind is with the UN's definition of just war, which is any war in defense of national sovereignty. Not surprising, says Luban, given that the UN is an association of sovereigns, not citizens. Luban would like to see it revised to read any war in defense of socially basic human rights. The issue for us here, however, is whether freedom of association really is a socially basic human right, against which no sovereign may legitimately offend. And on this score, it seems we have yet, even here in the West, to have reached any kind of stable consensus. Many on the Christian right will defend to the death freedom of association for the purposes of worship, though of course not for Muslims, but they would deny freedom of sexual association to homosexuals. Many on the liberal left would insist on a woman's right to control her own body, but, because we don't want to see our jobs take flight to India, vehemently deny that there's a right to free trade, and so on. So, final section. The compromise view, and I suppose it's also mine, is premised on the observation that rights come and go depending on the material exigencies that make them both possible and advisable. Women have the right to control their own reproductivity, at least here in the West in 2016, because we don't need a whole lot of reproduction out of them right now. Gay rights are on the ascendancy right across the West because gays have fewer, if any, children. They therefore have more discretionary income, and so marketers want to be free to more directly access this increasingly affluent sector. The borders came down in Western Europe because it was judged to be the only way to avoid yet another continental war, and so on. And so likewise, the walls we've built to keep people from sharing in our good fortune here in the West have come down when and as it's been in our interest to lower them, and so they'll come down again when and as it will be in our interest to lower them, at which time, mark my words, a discourse will develop replacing compassion for the would-be immigrant with the right of association for the would-be importer of the immigrant. The beginnings of this recognition of this right in our immigration policies is already manifest in the privileging of family unification. But as the nuclear solar system view of the family is gradually replaced by the rainbow view, i.e. the view that families are voluntary associations rather than reproductive ones, this shift is bound to be reflected in our immigration policies. If you can bring in your gay lover, why can't the old geezer bring in his third world prostitute? And if he can bring in his prostitute, why can't I bring in my abattoir worker? All this will take time, and as demonstrated by events in Europe over the past few years, it will be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, pretty much all the way, but it is happening. And so our geezer will get his Jamaican prostitute, but unfortunately, by the time he does, he just may be too old to know what to do with her.